Hello everybody, my name is Clay Williams and today I want to talk to you about painting patterns. When you're done painting your model, you may find a unit or a special character that you want to stand out in the Army. So I have my Crimson Fist Marine here, and I've decided I want to put a checkerboard pattern on his shoulder pad. Now, a checkerboard pattern is usually on a flat surface. So first we're going to cover how to put a straight pattern onto a curved surface and how to make it easier. So, when you paint a checkerboard, a black and white checkerboard, first colors you might grab are black and white. Let's say put those up for a second. And let's grab our Stonewall Gray, because we're gonna wanna paint that shoulder pad white before we start putting in our black checkers. Now what the gray is gonna do is it's gonna help us coat that white onto the shoulder pad, and it's also giving us a shade for our white, because on this shoulder pad, I have a shade, I have a natural shade. So I want my pattern to be shaded as well. And I don't want to have to paint all those checks in individual color. I want to get my white, a nice good gradient on that shoulder pad before I even start painting my checks. So, starting with my gray, I'm gonna layer it on my shoulder pad here. And I'm gonna go pretty thick. I'm not gonna thin this paint. I want to get a nice, solid base coat on my shoulder pad. I need a cup of water. Can't grab it. Yeah. So you'll notice that this light gray coats way better than if I had started with just a plain white paint to do my white checks. So that's one of the strengths of building up and layering, and it's also, again, going to be one of our shades for building a gradient on the white checks. Now it's still going to take a couple coats. So we're going to let that dry for a second. And there's another detail that I want to put on this guy. I want to put a nice crimson stripe on one of the knee pads, because he's got his crimson helmet and he's got a crimson, his crimson fist. So we want to balance out those colors just a little bit, and we want to add a little bit more red to one of the knee pads. So I'm going to take the knee pad on the same side that his fist is, and I'm going to take my gray, and again, I'm going to use that as a base layer for my red, because it's a little bit easier to paint that red over a dark color if I have a lighter base color. So when I'm painting a straight line, I want to pull the brush toward me, because this action is a lot easier to control than it is pushing the brush up or trying to push it sideways. Nice, slow motions. And you don't want to use a super tiny brush for this, because if you do, that paint's going to dry before you can work with it. You'll notice I didn't load my brush but once painting this stripe. So I don't want to go back and forth and back and forth. I want to load my brush, paint this small little stripe on the knee pad. As my base coat for my red. All right, now that I've done that, I think my shoulder pad's ready for another coat. So again, I'm gonna grab pretty thick gray, load up my brush, and try and knock out most of that blue and really dark, almost black blue. It's on the shoulder pad. You don't want your paint too thick. You don't want to see your brush strokes, but you want it just thick enough to where you can get a nice opaque color in just a few layers. All right, so now that we have our base gray on our shoulder pad, let's take our white. Add it to our palette. And let's do 2 layers for our highlight. So we're going to take this fairly light gray that we have for our white. We're going to mix about 50-50 as a second layer. We're going to do a pretty quick highlight on this. Let's take this color and let's do the knee pad real quick. Just a couple brush strokes. Let that shoulder pad dry for a second. Have a little bit of a highlight there on my knee pad. Now I'm going to layer in, and we don't have to be too accurate with this because we're going to break this up with checks, the different tones. Don't have to be blended because they're going to be more than likely covered up. And we're also going to do a little bit of finish work on those checks once we're done. All right, we got that. We're going to let that dry for a second. All right, now let's move on to our white. And just like we would highlight a shoulder pad that's going to be white, we're going to hit the middle, poke that curvature out a little bit. And we're going to pull toward our highlight as we're adding our white. Let that dry for a second. It's going to need one more coat because white, as I'm sure you know, is always a hard color to work with. So you need to be patient and layer it up. Let's go ahead and add a little bit of white to our knee pad here on our stripe. Just like we would on the shoulder pad, we can accentuate the shape even with our squad markings or individual unit markings. Just about 2 layers looks like it's going to do it with this white over this lighter gray that we put down as our base coat. So now we have a slight gradient that we can start developing our pattern over. So now we're ready for our black. And again, using the same brush, we're using a size 0 Winsor Newton Series 7. Don't need to grab a triple aught tiny brush with no bristles. It's not going to hold any paint. What I want to do is I want to get a fairly thin black. Make sure that the brush is pretty wet. That way the paint won't dry and I'm not going to struggle to pull my lines with dry paint. So where I want to start my checkerboard is I want to draw a line straight down the middle of this shoulder pad. So I take the most extreme part of the curve and pull a line. Again, I'm pulling toward me. And I'm not super worried about how thin or how thick it gets or if it's wobbly here and there. We're going to go in and we're going to add black checks and those will get covered up here in a minute. So I got my line. Now what I want to do is I want to pull from the high point of the object down to the middle. So that would be the center of the shoulder pad. I want to pick a distance and I want to pull a line the same distance straight down the shoulder pad. All right. Now I'm going to do that on the other side as well. All right. Now, once I have those 2 lines, I'm going to turn the model over so I can pull toward me, and I'm going to pull that line, again, keeping it the same distance from that center line. Now, the reason I did that is because if I try to pull that line all the way from the top of the shoulder pad down, that curvature is going to throw off where my lines move side to side. And I don't want my checkers to get smaller and larger as they move down the curvature. I want to make sure that they have the same width. So each time I add a new line, I'm going to pick a point kind of halfway through the line, and I'm going to keep it the same distance from that line that's right next to it. Same thing. Turn it over so you can pull your brush toward you. Pull that checker line. Now right there I had to go up a little bit because his backpack was in the way, and that's okay. Sometimes you just have to because we're working on a 3D surface, not a flat surface. I'm going to go ahead here and finish up the rest of these lines doing the same technique. Got just a little one there in the corner. Developing my grid for these checkers. Add some more water to your brush. If your brush feels like the paint isn't unloading when you're drawing these lines like you want it to, don't try and force the brush to make a mark. Go ahead, reload your brush. You don't want to be frustrated while you're trying to do this. All right, so now I have my basic checkerboard lines laid out for the vertical stripes. So now we're going to work across, and just as we did with the vertical lines, for the horizontal, I'm going to pick a high point, and I'm going to draw these lines, or this line, from the high point halfway, and I'm going to keep it as even to the vertical lines and is squared up over this curved surface using those vertical lines as a guide, as a reference. All right, so there, that line follows the curvature and it stays perpendicular to the vertical lines. Again, starting halfway, pulling towards myself, and now I want to keep the spacing even. Turn it over. Pull it down. So now we have the bottom of our check pattern, and I'm going to work on the top. And again, we got this shoulder pad vent that's a little bit close, so we might have to fudge where we pull our line to. And using that first horizontal line as a reference, making sure I keep lined up with it. Having to reposition to dodge this vent. So now I have an even pattern of same size squares to make up my checker pattern. Now I got to decide which of these squares I want to be black. So I like the highlight that I have in this square here. So I'm going to take the adjacent square and just fill it in. And now I'm just going to start filling in these checkers. now that I have my, my grid laid out. And if I go outside the lines a little bit, it's okay. I can touch those up. But it's important that you thin down your paint while you're doing this. Again, you don't want to be fighting the medium. You don't want to have dry paint on the end of your brush. You're going to increase your chance to make mistakes if the paint isn't acting how you want it to on the tip of the brush. So make sure you got that mixture down, that thinness of the paint down. Sometimes you're going to have parts that are hard to get to in there. Just take your brush. Again, don't worry about getting outside the lines. Just make sure you get some of that color in there. You can always go back and take some of your white and fix that up. We're going to enforce these patterns later with a little bit of line highlighting. And that's going to be our step that really cleans these squares up. Now, if you're working with colored checks, I'd recommend you always, always, always start with your lighter color. One, it's going to be easier to lay in your darker color over a lighter color, so you're not going to have to paint your pattern multiple times. You want to go through and do one pass and be done with it. Because the more times you have to touch that pattern, the greater you're increasing your risk of messing up and getting paint where you don't want it. Alright, so now I have my checkered pattern on the shoulder pad. When we draw lines as our guide, the shapes that are inside those lines are always going to be bigger because the line adds width to the pattern. So I want to go back in and I want to make my white checks a little bit bigger so that they match the size of those black checks. So in order to do that, I'm going to draw an edge highlight on the bottom of each white check. So just a small little L. And again, you want to work with a fairly thin consistency. And what this is going to do, it's going to make the pattern pop out just a little bit more. So I'm going to start and I'm going to do the left side of each white box and the bottom of each white box. And I'm going to go inside, I'm going to cover the black just a little bit to increase the size of the white check. And again, with this, you want to pull down toward your hand or toward your body, because that's going to give you the most control. As I'm doing this, I'm doing maybe a row, the bottom of each row, and then turning it and doing left side of each row. That way I don't have to reset as many times and do each box by turn, turn, turn. I'm using fairly thick paint, not super thin, in order to get the white to cover. And again, the reason I'm cheating and using a little thicker paint is because I don't want to have to do multiple layers of this edge highlight on the box. As you get to the corner, you might need to adjust multiple times. Now we have a small edge highlight on the bottom of each white square, and that's making that pattern pop out just a little bit more, and it's increased the size of each square so that they match the black squares better in ratio. So now I want to do the same thing with the black square. So I'm going to take my black and I'm going to mix up a medium to dark gray, and I'm going to use that as my edge for the black. And what that's going to do is going to help me clean up the pattern just a little bit. And it's going to give me a highlight that makes that black square pop out. Makes that pattern more visible. Well, black and white is always going to be a fairly visible pattern. But if I'm doing something like orange and red, I want to make sure that those orange and red squares that I took the time to paint show up. Now, if you're feeling adventurous, you can always add more layers of highlight to these. You can shade each individual square if you want, but for today, we're just trying to get a quick unit marking done. You can apply these steps, and just like layering, you can mix up varying shades of gray and highlight up each one of these squares to give it more shape and definition. So now that we have our pattern in here, we want to go ahead and reinforce the edge of the shoulder pad. So I'm going to take my black wash and I'm going to grab my liner. So this is a specialized brush. It has a very long bristle on it. And what that does is, one, it helps the life of the brush. It means it's going to last longer, because as I use wash, you'll notice when I bend this brush, it's bending farther up than where the ferrule is, and that's because all the wash is collected in the brush, and it has, it's starting to destroy it. Washes will destroy brushes very quickly, and so these longer bristles help the life. The other reason is that this brush unloads like a fountain pen. So we have more wash in our brush, so we can use it for a longer amount of time. I don't have to go from my pot to my model as much. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to load it up. And then I'm just going to trace the line around the shoulder pad. And you'll notice I don't have to go back and load up my wash over and over again, because this brush holds a lot of paint. And there's a trick with wash. If you go over the area and there's not enough wash, the moisture that gets trapped in the edge where you put the brush, if you reload your brush and then put it there, that moisture is going to follow where there is already moisture, and it's going to distribute itself better. And you can always go back if you get too much wash somewhere. You can wipe out your brush and you can use it to soak up some extra wash. But right now I got a good amount on there, and I want to keep that. All right, let's go back to our knee pad that we put our stripe on, and let's do our crimson marking. I'm going to get my Vallejo Heavy Red, and I'm going to get one of the airbrush paints, the Game Air Bloody Red. So let's start with the Game Air Bloody Red. And the reason I want to start with my lighter color when I'm doing this is because I've already highlighted that stripe. And I'm just going to use a glaze in order to get that marking on. The reason I'm using a glaze is because that white stark contrast between the black and the light gray is going to accept that red a lot easier. And so if I go outside my lines with that red, I'm not going to see it. It's going to barely be visible. So all the work's already been done. So I take this thin red and layer it on pretty quickly. And even if I go outside the line a little bit with my red, see, I'm putting my brush over the intersection of the blue, and I've done it several times now. I can see where the marking is because I put that light gray and white. I can barely see where that red is. So as long as my marking in my gray is solid, I don't have to worry about where the paint's going. I can paint quickly and get it done. All right, see, I didn't even have to highlight it either. I have a darker red here and a brighter red at the top of the knee pad. But I want to take a little bit of my darker red and just put it in the shadow. Because he's a crimson fist, he's not a blood fist. Gonna take that bottom section, and I'm just gonna put a little bit of that dark red, just a touch. And then we'll be done adding our markings to our crimson fist. All right, that is it. We're all finished up. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to learn some more painting techniques, go ahead and check out some of the other videos on the channel. And we'll see you guys next time.